My name is Margherita Silvestri, and I need to tell you something that happened to me 6 months ago. Something that saved my life on the exact night I had decided to end it. I'm 85 years old now, and for most of those years I've been more ghost than woman, more shadow than person. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from where I was that night, in my small apartment in Rome, with a bottle of pills in my trembling hand, and nothing left to lose. You see, I live alone. I've lived alone for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to have someone say my name with recognition, with warmth, with anything other than the polite distance reserved for old women who don't matter anymore. My neighbors know me only as the quiet old lady in apartment 3B. I've lived there for 12 years, and I couldn't tell you the names of the people on either side of me. The girl at the corner market gives me the same practiced smile she gives everyone, bags my groceries with efficient movements while looking past me to the next customer. I buy the same things every week, a small amount of pasta, some vegetables that will probably go bad before I eat them all, bread that I'll toast one slice at a time because there's no one to share it with. I am invisible. I have been invisible for so long that I'd stopped remembering what it felt like to be seen. There was a time when students would light up when they saw me, when parents would thank me for caring about their children, when friends would invite me for coffee just to talk. But that was a different lifetime, a different Margherita, who existed before grief hollowed her out and left only a shell going through the motions. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time when I was Margherita Silvestri, primary school teacher in Assisi, young widow, but proud mother of the most beautiful boy you've ever seen. Pietro, my Pietro, with his almond-shaped eyes that seemed to hold entire universes, with his smile that could light up the darkest room. He was 9 years old the last time I saw him. 9 years old, with scraped knees from playing football in the schoolyard, with ink stains on his fingers from practicing his handwriting, with that gap-toothed grin that made my heart swell every single time. I remember everything about him with this painful clarity that hasn't faded even after 61 years. The way he'd wake up in the morning with his dark hair sticking up in every direction. How he'd shuffle into the kitchen, still half asleep, and lean against me while I made his breakfast. The sound of his laughter, bright and uninhibited, in the way only children can laugh. He loved drawing, spent hours with colored pencils, creating elaborate scenes of knights and dragons and castles. I still remember the last picture he made, the night before the field trip. It was of the two of us, standing in front of our house, both smiling, a bright yellow sun in the corner of the page. His father had died when Pietro was only 5, a sudden heart attack that left us both reeling. But we'd made a life together, just the two of us. I worked as a teacher, and Pietro was my reason for everything, my purpose, my joy. He was supposed to grow up and maybe become an artist, or a teacher like me, or whatever he wanted to be. He was supposed to have a full life ahead of him. That was 1963, 61 years ago, though sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime, that belonged to someone else entirely. Pietro disappeared during a school field trip to some Roman ruins near Perugia. I remember the day they told me with the kind of clarity that pain burns into your memory forever. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was at home grading papers when there was a knock on my door. The principal stood there with a police officer, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. The principal could barely speak. It was the police officer who finally told me. Pietro had wandered off during a break at the ruins. They'd searched immediately, calling his name, checking every corner. Nothing. Search parties had been organized within hours. I remember racing to Perugia, joining the search myself, calling his name until my voice went hoarse, scrambling through brush and over rocks until my hands were bleeding. We searched for 3 months. 3 months of waking up every morning with hope and going to bed every night with despair. The professional search and rescue teams came with dogs and equipment. They covered miles of countryside. Local volunteers turned out in numbers that moved me even through my terror. We put up posters everywhere, his school photo plastered on every available surface in the region. I spent hours sitting by the phone, waiting for news, jumping at every ring. The police officer who handled our case was kind. He kept me updated on everything, even when there was nothing new to report. But I could see the hope fading from his eyes as days turned to weeks, turned to months. He tried to prepare me, gently, for the possibility that Pietro might not be found alive. I wouldn't listen. My son was out there somewhere, and we just had to keep looking. They found his school bag. It was torn and blood-stained, discovered at the bottom of a ravine. The police officer tried to be gentle when he told me. He said that most likely Pietro had fallen, that the body must have been carried away by the river during the rainy season, that sometimes nature doesn't give us back what we need for closure. Probable fatal fall, that's what the report said. I read it so many times, the paper became soft and worn from my fingers, tracing the words over and over, as if repetition might change their meaning. But there was never a body, never a funeral, just absence that grew inside me like a cancer, spreading through every part of my life until there was nothing left that wasn't infected by grief. I stopped teaching because I couldn't look at 9-year-old children without seeing my Pietro's face. I stopped smiling because joy felt like a betrayal. I stopped living in any real sense, just going through the mechanical motions of existing without purpose. I left Assisi in 1965. I couldn't stay there, couldn't walk past the school where he'd laughed with his friends, couldn't pass the park where I'd pushed him on the swings, couldn't survive in a place where every street corner held a memory that stabbed me in the chest. So I moved to Rome, thinking distance might help. But grief isn't something you can outrun. It travels with you, like invisible luggage, always there, always heavy, always reminding you of what you've lost. I even remarried briefly, took on a hyphenated surname, Silvestri Monti, though that marriage lasted less than 2 years. He was a kind man, but he couldn't love a woman who was already buried in a grave with her missing son. After he left, I went back to just Silvestri, back to being alone, back to the slow process of waiting to die. And that's what I've been doing for 61 years. Waiting. Existing in this small apartment with its faded wallpaper and creaking floors, with neighbors who don't know me, and a life that stopped having meaning on a spring day in 1963. I wake up each morning out of habit, nothing more. My body keeps going, even though my soul gave up decades ago. October 12th, 2024. That was the night everything changed. October 12th is Pietro's birthday. He would have been 70 years old. 70. My baby boy, who I last saw at 9, would have been a grandfather himself by now. The thought was unbearable. It had been unbearable for 61 years, but that night, something in me finally broke completely. I'd been collecting the pills for months. My doctor had prescribed them for various old age ailments, and I'd been carefully not taking them, saving them instead. By October 12th, I had enough. More than enough. I looked at the bottle sitting on my nightstand, and I felt something like relief. Finally, I thought. Finally, I can stop carrying this weight. I had no one to leave a note for. No one who would miss me beyond a landlord annoyed about finding a body. That's what my life had become. 85 years old, and the only people who would notice my absence would be inconvenienced by it, not saddened. The thought didn't make me cry anymore. I was beyond tears. I was just tired. So impossibly tired. It was 11 p.m. when I sat down on my bed, the pill bottle in my shaking hands. I'd turned off all the lights except for the small lamp on my nightstand. I was ready. After 61 years of half-living, I was finally ready to stop. And then I heard it, a soft knock on my door. I froze. Nobody visited me. Nobody. Especially not at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, that my mind was already starting to play tricks. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Gentle but insistent. My voice came out rusty when I called out, asking who was there. And then I heard the response, heard words that stopped my heart in my chest. The voice said it needed to speak with me, that it was about Pietro. I don't remember moving to the door. 1 second, I was sitting on the bed. The next, I was yanking the door open so hard it banged against the wall. And there, standing in my poorly lit hallway, was a teenager. He couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, wearing a faded blue hoodie and old jeans and worn sneakers, looking like any kid you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Except for his eyes. His eyes looked like they'd seen things that teenagers shouldn't see, like they held knowledge that didn't belong to someone so young. I demanded to know who he was, how he dared to speak my son's name. My voice came out harsh, almost angry, because how dare this stranger invoke the name that had haunted me for 6 decades? But he didn't flinch. He just stood there with this calm certainty and told me his name was Carlo Acutis. Then he said the words that shattered my entire reality. He told me that Pietro hadn't died in 1963. He said my son was alive, that he was 70 years old and living in Milan, that he'd been searching for me for 55 years, but had been looking in all the wrong places. My legs gave out. I had to grab onto the door frame to keep from collapsing. I told him he was being cruel, that my son was dead, that the police had found his bloodied backpack, that there had been a report, an official conclusion. I was shaking, whether from rage or shock or desperate, terrible hope, I couldn't tell. But Carlo just walked into my apartment without waiting for an invitation, and he took my hand with this gentle firmness that somehow steadied me even as my world was spinning. And then he started telling me a story that sounded impossible, but that he told with such specific detail that I couldn't dismiss it as delusion. He explained that Pietro hadn't fallen into any ravine. He said my son had been kidnapped that day by a man named Giuseppe Torini, a school employee who had this sick obsession with having a family of his own. Giuseppe had taken Pietro, pretended to rescue him from some danger, driven him to Milan, and changed his name to Andrea Torini, registered him as an adopted son using forged documents. Carlo said that Pietro had tried to escape in those first years, but he was just a small child who didn't know his complete address, who only knew to say Assisi and his mother's name, Margherita. Giuseppe had died in 2018, and in a posthumous letter, he'd confessed everything. Pietro, who'd been living as Andrea for his entire adult life, had discovered the truth at 64 years old, and he'd been searching for me for 6 years. I collapsed onto the floor. I couldn't stand anymore, couldn't process what I was hearing. Carlo helped me into my chair, supporting me with surprising strength for someone so young. And I asked the question that was tearing through my mind. Why hadn't Pietro found me? Why hadn't I found him? Carlo explained it with this patient gentleness. I'd moved from Assisi to Rome in 1965. I'd changed my surname to Silvestri Monti after my brief marriage. Pietro had been searching for Margherita Silvestri in Assisi. The records hadn't connected. I'd believed he was dead. He'd believed I might have died from grief or moved without leaving any trace. Two people looking for each other in mazes that ran side by side but never intersected. I looked at the pill bottle sitting on my table. I'd been seconds away from swallowing every last one. And if what this boy was saying was true, if my Pietro was really out there, really alive, I would have killed myself and left him to search forever, to never know that his mother had loved him every single day of his absence. I asked Carlo how I could trust this wasn't just a hallucination, some cruel trick my senile mind was playing on itself. And that's when he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his hoodie pocket. He handed it to me, and I opened it with trembling fingers. It was an address. Via Vigevano, 23, Milan, apartment 5C. And below that, Carlo had written something that made my breath catch. He said that Pietro had a crescent moon-shaped scar on his left knee, from when he'd fallen off his bicycle at 7 years old, and I'd run barefoot through the streets, carrying him to the hospital, my heart pounding with terror, while he cried against my shoulder. Carlo looked at me with those ancient eyes, and told me I was the only person in the world who knew the exact story of that scar. He told me to go today, before it was too late for both of us. Before I continue, I'm really curious. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're finding value in this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep sharing these experiences with all of you. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in my chair as Carlo let himself out, sat there holding that piece of paper with an address that might contain my son, sat there as my entire understanding of the past 61 years crumbled and rebuilt itself. Every cell in my body was screaming that this had to be a lie, that dead children don't come back, that hope, this enormous, would only destroy me more completely when it turned out to be false. But that scar, that crescent moon on his left knee, I was the one who'd kissed it better after the doctor stitched it up. I was the one who'd told Pietro it looked like the moon we could see from his bedroom window. Nobody else knew that story. Nobody. At 6 in the morning, I was at the train station. I'd thrown some clothes into a bag, grabbed the money I'd been saving for my own funeral, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. The first train to Milan left at 6:30. The 3-hour journey felt like 3 lifetimes. The train car was mostly empty at that hour. A few business people with their laptops, a young couple sleeping against each other's shoulders, an old man reading a newspaper. Normal people doing normal things on a normal Tuesday morning. And there I was, an 85-year-old woman, clutching a piece of paper with an address that might change everything, traveling to meet a son I'd believed dead for longer than he'd been alive when I lost him. I couldn't sit still. My hands kept shaking. I'd read the address over and over, memorizing it, even though it was already burned into my brain. I tried to imagine what I'd say when the door opened. How do you greet someone who should be dead? How do you bridge 61 years in a single sentence? What if it was a mistake? The question kept circling through my mind. What if I got there and it was the wrong person? What if I knocked on that door and found a stranger who'd never heard of anyone named Pietro or Andrea? What if I got there and he was dead, had died in the 6 years since he'd started searching, and I was too late yet again? I thought about all the ways I could have found him earlier, if I'd stayed in Assisi instead of running away from the memories, if I'd kept my original surname, if I'd been more persistent in my searches. 61 years of parallel lives that could have intersected at any point, if just one variable had been different. But what if it was true? What if my baby was alive? What if I could see him one more time before I died? What if Carlo Acutis, this impossible teenage saint, had really appeared at my door to save 2 lives in one night? I thought about the pills, how close I'd come. If Carlo had knocked just an hour later, if I'd been more decisive in my plan to die, none of this would be happening. The weight of that near miss was staggering. How many times in our lives do we come within moments of missing our miracles? The train pulled into Milan's central station at 9:27 a.m. I took a taxi, gave the driver the address on Via Vigevano, and watched the city blur past. Milan was busy and loud and alive, and I felt completely detached from it all, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. The building was old, with a faded facade. There was no elevator. I had to climb 5 flights of stairs, and by the time I reached the 5th floor, my lungs were burning, and my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I stood outside apartment 5C for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, staring at the door, trying to make myself not. What do you say to a son you haven't seen in 61 years? What do you say to a child who's now a 70-year-old man? How do you span that kind of distance? I rang the doorbell. I heard heavy footsteps approaching from inside the apartment, slow and deliberate. The door opened, and I saw him. A man in his 70s stood there, his hair completely white, wearing glasses, his face marked by time in ways that made him a stranger. But his eyes, oh God, his eyes, those almond-shaped eyes I'd seen in my dreams every single night for 61 years. The eyes I'd last seen when they belonged to a 9-year-old boy. Pietro's eyes. We stood there, frozen, just looking at each other. He asked if he could help me, polite and kind, the way you'd speak to any elderly stranger at your door. His voice was deep and unfamiliar, nothing like the child's voice I remembered, but there was something in it that felt like coming home. My voice broke when I spoke. I asked him if he had a crescent moon-shaped scar on his left knee. I watched the color drain from his face, and then, without saying a word, he reached down and pulled up the leg of his pants. There it was, the crescent moon, the same shape I'd memorized when he was 7, when I'd kissed it 1,000 times while it healed, when I'd promised him it made him special. He whispered one word, and it was a question and a prayer and a revelation all at once. He said, "Mother," in Italian, "Mamma," like the word had been locked inside him for 6 decades and was finally being released. I said his name, Pietro. And then we weren't strangers anymore. We were just a mother and son falling into each other's arms in a hallway, crying for everything we'd lost and everything we'd found. I don't know how long we stood there holding each other. Time didn't mean anything in that moment. He was taller than me now, this man who'd been my little boy, and I buried my face against his chest and sobbed in a way I hadn't let myself sob in 61 years. He was shaking, and he kept saying, "Mama," over and over, like he was making sure it was real, making sure I was real. Eventually, we made it inside his apartment. It was modest but comfortable, lived in. There were photos on the walls, people I didn't recognize, a life I'd never been part of. He made us coffee with trembling hands, and then he started telling me everything. He told me about that day in 1963, the school trip to the ruins. He remembered Giuseppe Torini approaching him, remembered being told there was a problem, that his mother had been in an accident and he needed to come quickly. He'd been 9 years old and scared, and he trusted the adult who said he was there to help. Giuseppe had driven him to Milan, to an apartment Pietro had never seen before, and then the psychological manipulation had begun. Giuseppe told him I was dead, that there was no one to take care of him anymore, but Giuseppe was going to be his new father. Pietro screamed and cried and tried to run away, but he was a child in a strange city, and Giuseppe kept him locked in the apartment for months until he was too afraid to try escaping again. The documents were forged: birth certificate, adoption papers, everything that made Pietro into Andrea Torini. He was enrolled in a new school under his new name, given a new birthday, a new history. Giuseppe told everyone that he'd adopted a boy who'd lost his parents, and nobody questioned it, because this was the 1960s, when record-keeping wasn't what it is now. Pietro told me he'd grown up always feeling like something was fundamentally wrong. He'd had these fragmented memories of before, of a mother with soft hands and a gentle voice, of a town with old stone buildings, of being called a different name. But Giuseppe had been consistent in his story, had told him over and over that these were just confused childhood dreams. He tried to search when he got older, in his 20s and 30s, but he only had pieces, a first name, a vague sense of a town. Giuseppe had told him his mother's name was Maria, had told him she'd died in a car accident, and Pietro had half believed it, even while some part of him knew it wasn't true. And then in 2018, Giuseppe had died. And in cleaning out his belongings, Pietro, who was 64 years old by then, had found a box hidden in the back of a closet. Inside was a confession letter written by Giuseppe to be found after his death. In it, he'd admitted everything: the kidnapping, the forged papers, the real name, Margherita Silvestri, Pietro Silvestri, Assisi. Pietro said reading that letter was like dying and being reborn at the same time. Everything he'd suspected, every fragmented memory, every feeling that his life was built on a lie, it was all confirmed. But it also meant that the man he'd called father for 61 years was actually his kidnapper. It meant his real mother might still be alive. It meant he had a chance to find the truth. He'd started searching immediately. He'd hired private investigators. He'd combed through records in Assisi, looking for any trace of Margherita Silvestri. But the trail had gone cold. I'd moved to Rome. I'd changed my surname when I remarried. The Margherita Silvestri he was searching for in Assisi didn't exist anymore in the records. He told me he'd thought about me every single day for 6 years, wondered if I was still alive, if I'd moved on, if I'd forgotten about the son who'd disappeared. He'd never imagined I was in Rome, alone, believing he was dead, carrying the grief of his loss for 61 years. We cried together for all of it, for the decades stolen from us, for the birthdays and Christmases and ordinary days we'd never gotten to share. He told me about his life. He'd married, had 2 daughters. The marriage had ended in divorce, but he had his girls, Giulia and Francesca, who were now in their 40s. He was a grandfather. I had granddaughters I'd never met, great-grandchildren who didn't know I existed. an entire family tree that had grown in my absence. The weight of that loss was staggering, but so was the possibility of what could still be. Pietro asked me about my life, and I had to tell him the truth, that I'd never really lived after he disappeared, that I'd been alone for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to matter to anyone. And then I told him about the pills, about October 12th, about my plan to end it all on his birthday. He started crying again when I told him that part. He said I'd been about to kill myself the night before we reunited, that I'd been one day away from making it impossible for him to ever find me. If Carlo Acutis hadn't knocked on my door when he did, if I'd taken those pills even an hour earlier, Pietro would have spent the rest of his life searching for a mother who was already dead. That's when I told him about Carlo, about the teenager who'd appeared at my door at 11 p.m., who'd known things he couldn't possibly know, who'd given me Pietro's address and told me to go before it was too late. Pietro got very quiet when I described him, this boy in the blue hoodie with old eyes. Then Pietro told me something I hadn't known. Carlo Acutis was a real person, a teenager who'd died in 2006 from leukemia. He'd been 15 years old, had been devoted to cataloguing Eucharistic miracles, had been beatified by the Catholic Church in 2020. He was buried in Assisi, in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore. He was on his way to sainthood. I felt chills run through my entire body. The boy who'd saved my life, who'd given me back my son, had been dead for 18 years. I'd touched his hand. I'd looked into his eyes. He'd been as solid and real as anyone I'd ever met. And he'd been a saint, intervening at the exact moment I needed intervention most. Pietro and I went to Assisi together the next week. We stood in front of Carlo's tomb, and I cried and thanked him for saving 2 lives that night, mine and my son's. Because if I'd died, Pietro would have died too, in a different way. He would have spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of never knowing what happened to his mother. The months since that reunion have been the first real living I've done in 61 years. I moved to Milan, into Pietro's guest room. He insisted, wouldn't hear of any other arrangement. His daughters, my granddaughters, came to meet me within days. They'd grown up knowing their father had been searching for someone, had seen him obsessively going through records and hiring investigators. Giulia and Francesca call me Nonna, grandmother, and they hold me with this careful tenderness, like I'm something precious and fragile. They've introduced me to my great-grandchildren, beautiful babies and toddlers who climb into my lap and pull on my hair and fill my heart with a joy I thought I'd never feel again. Pietro threw away the pill bottle when I told him my plan for that night. He held it in his hand and looked at me with such pain in his eyes, told me I'd been about to end my life mere hours before the reunion I'd waited 61 years for. He said that God and Carlo Acutis had held me back for just one more day, had intervened at the last possible moment. We visit Carlo's tomb every month now. It's become our ritual, mine and Pietro's. We take flowers, we light candles, and I tell anyone who will listen about what this young saint did for us. I tell them that he appeared to me the night I was planning to die, that he gave me information he couldn't possibly have known, that he saved a mother and son who'd been separated by one of the cruelest crimes imaginable. People ask me sometimes how I cope with the grief of what was stolen from us. 61 years. I missed watching my son grow up. I missed his first day of high school, his graduation, his wedding, the births of his daughters. He missed having a mother for all of those moments, missed coming home to someone who loved him unconditionally. The man who did this to us, Giuseppe Torini, he's dead now. He can't be punished, can't be held accountable. There's no justice in the traditional sense. That's something I've had to make peace with. The reality that some wrongs can't be made right can only be lived with. But here's what I've learned in these past 6 months. You can't get back lost time, but you can cherish found time. Every morning I wake up in Pietro's house and hear him making coffee in the kitchen. I feel gratitude so intense, it almost hurts. Every Sunday when we have family dinner and my granddaughters and great-grandchildren gather around the table, I look at all these faces that came from my son, and I feel blessed in a way I never thought I'd feel again. I'm 85 years old. I won't get decades with my found family. That's just reality. But I'll get years, and I'll get months, and I'll get days, and I'll get moments. And after 61 years of having nothing but grief and absence, those moments feel like miracles. Pietro and I talk about that night often, about the impossibility of the timing. If Carlo had come even a day later, I would have been dead. If I'd taken the pills earlier in the evening, I would have been beyond saving. If Giuseppe had never written that confession letter, Pietro might never have known the truth. If any of 1,000 variables had been different, we never would have found each other. But they weren't different. A saint who died in 2006 appeared in 2024 to stop a suicide and reunite a family. That's what happened, whether it makes logical sense or not. I know what I saw. I know whose hand I held. I know who gave me that address and told me not to give up. There are people who hear this story and think I must be confused, that I must have hallucinated Carlo's visit, that grief and age have made me unreliable. Let them think what they want. I know what saved my life. I know who intervened. And I know that miracles don't always look the way we expect them to look. Sometimes a miracle is a teenager in a blue hoodie showing up at your door with impossible information. Sometimes a miracle is discovering that the son you mourned for 61 years has been alive the entire time, searching for you while you searched for him. Sometimes a miracle is getting a second chance at family when you're 85 years old and thought you'd die alone. Pietro keeps his father's confession letter in a locked box. He's shown it to me, this document that destroyed and freed him simultaneously. Giuseppe wrote that he'd loved Pietro like a son, that he'd given him a good life, that he'd justified it to himself for decades. But he also admitted it was wrong, admitted he'd stolen a child from his mother, admitted the magnitude of his sin. I've read that letter multiple times now, trying to understand the mind of a man who could do such a thing. Giuseppe was lonely, desperate for family, psychologically disturbed in ways that made him capable of unthinkable actions. But understanding doesn't mean forgiving. I'll never forgive what he did. The grief of 61 lost years doesn't just disappear because we've been reunited, but I also can't let hate consume what time I have left. Giuseppe is dead. Hating him won't bring back the decades we lost. All I can do is love Pietro now, love my granddaughters now, love my great-grandchildren now, and make the most of whatever time remains. There's something else I need to tell you. If you're listening to this right now, if you're in the kind of despair I was in, if you're at the point where ending it all seems like the only option, please wait. Wait one more day. Wait one more hour. Wait long enough for your miracle to arrive, because it might be closer than you think. I was holding pills in my hand, seconds away from swallowing them, when Carlo knocked on my door. Seconds. If I'd been more decisive, I would have been dead before he arrived, and I would have missed everything that came after. I would have missed holding my son again. I would have missed meeting my granddaughters. I would have missed being called nonna by beautiful children who carry my blood in their veins. Your timing might be just as close. Your intervention might be just as imminent. Please don't rob yourself of the chance to find out. Please don't make it impossible for your miracle to reach you. And if you're someone who's lost a child, if you're living with the unbearable grief of a disappearance, if you've been told your child is dead, but there was never a body, never certainty, please don't stop looking. Pietro was alive when I thought he was dead. He was searching when I'd given up. We were both out there, both grieving, separated only by circumstances and bad information and the cruelty of one man's actions. The absence of a body is not proof of death. It's proof of uncertainty. And uncertainty, as terrible as it is, leaves room for hope. I know how hard it is to hold on to hope when years turn into decades, when every lead goes nowhere, when the world tells you to accept and move on. But I'm living proof that sometimes, against all odds, the impossible becomes possible. Before I finish this story, I want to ask you something. Did this story move you? Did it give you hope, or make you think differently about giving up, or remind you that miracles still happen in this world? If it did, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what this meant to you. And please, subscribe if you haven't already. These stories need to be shared, need to reach the people who need them most. I visit Carlo's tomb with Pietro every month, and each time I go, I see other people there. People praying for intercession, people asking for help, people desperate for miracles of their own. I always stop and talk to them if they'll let me. I tell them my story. I tell them that Carlo saved my life and reunited my family. I tell them not to give up, because saints see things we can't see, work in ways we don't understand, intervene at moments that seem impossible, but turn out to be perfectly timed. Some of them believe me. Some of them think I'm a crazy old woman. That's okay. I'm just telling the truth about what happened to me, about how a saint who died 18 years ago showed up at my door when I needed him most, about how my dead son turned out to be alive, about how the worst night of my life became the beginning of something beautiful. There are still hard moments. Sometimes Pietro and I will be having coffee, and one of us will start crying, overwhelmed by everything we missed, by all the moments we can never get back. We cry for the little boy who grew up without his mother, for the mother who aged into an old woman without her son. But then Julia or Francesca will call, or one of the great-grandchildren will come running into the room, and we're pulled back into the present, into the life we have now rather than the life we lost. And the present, imperfect as it is, shortened by my age and our late reunion, is still precious, still worth living, still more than I ever thought I'd have again. I'm 85 years old. I probably don't have many years left, but the years I have will be spent with my son, with my family, with people who love me and know me and make me visible again after decades of being a ghost. That's more than most people get at my age. That's a gift I'll never take for granted. Every night before I go to sleep, I thank Carlo Acutis. I thank him for knocking on my door, for giving me one more day, for seeing what I couldn't see, for intervening when heaven felt silent and help felt impossible. I thank him for saving my life when I didn't want it saved, for being right when I was so certain I was at the end. And every night I thank God for the miracle of found love, for the son who survived when I thought he was dead, for the years we still get to share, for the family I thought I'd lost forever. I spent 61 years believing my life was over, that my story had ended on that spring day in 1963 when Pietro disappeared. But I was wrong. My story didn't end, it just paused. And on October 12th, 2024, when a teenage saint knocked on my door and told me my son was alive, my story started again. At 85 years old, I got a new chapter. I got a second chance. I got my Pietro back. So if you're at the end of your rope, if you're holding pills in your hand, or standing at the edge of a bridge, or making plans that feel final, I'm begging you to wait. Wait for your knock on the door. Wait for your intervention. Wait for your Carlo Acutis, whatever form that takes. Because miracles are real, and they happen when we least expect them, and they can change everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Your son might not be dead. Your daughter might still be searching. Your miracle might be one day away, 1 hour away, 1 moment away. Don't close the door before it has a chance to knock. Don't end your story before you know how it really ends. I almost missed my miracle. I was seconds away from making it impossible. But Carlo Acutis intervened, and now I'm here, in Milan, in my son's home, surrounded by family I never thought I'd meet, living a life I never thought I'd have. It's not the life I would have chosen, with all its lost decades and stolen moments, but it's life, real and precious, and worth every breath. I'm Margherita Silvestri. I'm 85 years old. I have my son back after 61 years, and I'm alive to tell you this story because a teenage saint loved me enough to stop me from ending it one day too soon. Don't give up. Please, don't give up. Your miracle might be closer than you think.